Ambassador had traveled across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy in her long career with the Confederacy. She had seen crystal cities that sang when wind passed through them. She had walked on worlds where the sky burned purple and the oceans floated above the land. She had negotiated with species so different from her own that they communicated through color changes and magnetic pulses. But nothing in all her years of diplomatic service had prepared her for what she found on Earth. The human shuttle had deposited her delegation in a place called France. That meant nothing, too. It was simply a name for a section of the human. What confused her was why she had been brought here at all. The Confederacy needed military advisors. They were facing a border dispute with the Threshold Dominion that threatened to become violent. Humans had a reputation for warfare. They were known across the galaxy as a species that had somehow survived countless conflicts against each other and against alien threats. The Confederacy wanted to learn from them. So why was she standing in an empty field? The grass was green and short, trimmed with obvious care. A cold wind blew in from somewhere called the ocean, carrying a smell of salt that found strange but not unpleasant. The sky above was gray with thick clouds. Rain seemed likely, and stretching out before her in perfect rows were thousands upon thousands of small white stones. 4 eyes blinked in sequence as she tried to understand what she was seeing. The stones were identical in shape. Each one stood perhaps half a meter tall, rounded at the top, planted firmly in the green grass. They went on for what seemed like forever, row after row after row, covering the gentle hills of this unremarkable landscape. Her translator implant offered no immediate explanation. The stones were marked with symbols that she recognized as human writing, but the names meant nothing to her. Dates were listed as well. The dates were all similar. Most of them fell within a very short span of human time, perhaps a few months. Ambassador, a voice spoke beside her. She turned to find a human male approaching. He was old by their standards. His skin was weathered and spotted with age. His hair had gone white, cut very short against his skull. He wore clothing that seemed ceremonial rather than practical. A dark green jacket covered with colored ribbons and small metal symbols. A cap sat on his head, bearing more insignia. He walked with a slight stiffness, as if his joints caused him pain, but he moved with purpose and dignity. "I am Sergeant Major Harrison," he said. "Retired now. I volunteer as a guide for the Universal Military Heritage Foundation. Welcome to Normandy." His crest, a ridge of flexible cartilage that ran from her forehead to the back of her skull, flattened in confusion. She had been told to expect military experts, weapons specialists, strategic advisors, not an elderly human standing in a field of stones. "Thank you for your welcome," she said, falling back on diplomatic formality. "I must admit some confusion regarding our location. The Confederacy requested consultation on military matters. We face a potential conflict with the Threshold Dominion. Our leadership believed that human expertise might help us prepare." Sergeant Major nodded slowly. His face was difficult to read. Humans had such mobile features, constantly shifting and changing in ways that found hard to interpret. But she thought she saw something like understanding in his expression. "This is where your consultation begins," he said. "This is Normandy. On this ground, in what we call the year 1944, young humans from many nations landed on these beaches and threw themselves against fortified positions. They died by the thousands, not for territory, not for resources. They died to liberate people they had never met from tyranny they had never personally suffered." He gestured at the rows of white stones. "These mark where some of them now rest." Looked out at the stones again. Thousands of them, each one represented a dead human. The scale of it began to sink in. This was not merely a field, it was a memorial, a place of death preserved across centuries. "You maintain this?" she asked, "after so long?" "We do. The Universal Military Heritage Foundation was established to preserve human battlefields as sacred ground. Not just this one. hundreds of sites across Earth and beyond, places where humans fought and died for something they believed in. Sacred, repeated. The word translated roughly into her language, but the concept was difficult. You consider this dirt sacred? Did not seem offended by the question. He had probably heard it before. The dirt itself is just dirt. What makes it sacred is what happened here, the choices that were made, the sacrifices that were given. Noticed movement among the rows of stones. Other figures were walking there, stopping at individual markers, sometimes kneeling or standing in silence. Not all of them were human. She recognized the tall, spindly forms of their elongated limbs folded respectfully. There were meridians present as well, their translucent skin shimmering faintly even in the gray light. She even spotted a small cluster of the reclusive hive species that rarely interacted with outsiders. Aliens standing among human graves, treating them with obvious reverence. Why are they here? She asked. Turned to watch the visitors for a moment. They come from many worlds now. Word has spread. They want to understand. Understand what? The old human was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Every species eventually faces the question of what they are willing to die for. What principles matter more than survival? What causes justify the ultimate sacrifice? He looked back at. Humans have simply answered that question more often than most. These sites are our answers, written in blood and stone. A elder had stopped near one of the white markers. Its crest was lowered in what knew to be their species' gesture of profound respect. It stood motionless, reading the inscription, as if the name of a long-dead human held some meaning for it. I do not understand, admitted. These were your conflicts, you're dead. Why would other species care? Began walking slowly among the rows and followed. The grass was soft beneath her feet. The stones passed on either side, each one a life ended. Because they face their own conflicts now, said, their own choices, and they want to know how others have made those choices before them, not the tactics, not the weapons. Those are easy to learn. What is harder to learn is the will, the courage, the commitment to something larger than yourself. He stopped at one stone. It looked no different from the others. The same white material, the same rounded top, the same carved letters, but stood before it as if it were the most important object in the universe. Private James, he read, killed June 7, 1944. He was 19 years old. He came from a place called Ohio. He had never been outside his own country before the war, never seen the ocean, never met a French person. His voice remained steady, but something in it had changed. He died on this beach trying to reach a wall of concrete and steel, running through gunfire, watching his friends fall beside him. He did not know any of the people he was trying to save. He did not speak their language. He came anyway. He died anyway. Found herself staring at the stone. 19 years, so young by any species measure. Why, she asked, why would he do this? Because he believed it was right. Because evil was happening and someone had to stop it, and he decided that someone would be him. Turned to face her directly. That is what we preserve here, Ambassador. Not the dirt, not the stones. We preserve the memory of what ordinary beings can become when they choose to stand for something greater than themselves. The wind picked up, carrying the salt smell stronger now. Somewhere in the distance, waves crashed against the shore where humans had once landed in boats and died in the sand. His crest slowly rose again as something began to shift in her understanding. She had come looking for military expertise. She was beginning to realize that she might find something far more valuable. Show me more, she said. Sergeant Major nodded, and together they walked among the dead. The tour lasted 7 standard days. Had expected perhaps a brief visit to 1 or 2 sites before settling into proper military discussions. Instead, she found herself transported across the human and beyond, guided by a rotating cast of Foundation volunteers who seemed to share quiet intensity. Each guide was different in age and background, but they all carried themselves with the same sense of solemn purpose. The first stop after Normandy was a place called. The name meant nothing to initially. It was simply another patch of Earth's surface. But when she arrived, she began to understand why the Foundation had brought her here. The field had been preserved in a state of permanent memory. Where grass might have grown, the ground remained churned and muddy, exactly as it had been centuries ago. Shell craters pocked the landscape, some filled with dark water. Wooden boards created pathways through the worst of the mire, and everywhere holographic reconstructions showed what had happened here. Human soldiers moved through the projections like ghosts. They wore strange helmets and carried primitive weapons. They walked hunched over through trenches cut into the earth. Artillery shells exploded around them, throwing mud and debris into the air. Green clouds of chemical gas drifted across the battlefield, and the soldiers scrambled to put masks over their faces. Watched a reconstruction of an attack. A whistle blew, and hundreds of humans climbed out of their trenches and ran forward into a storm of gunfire. They fell by the dozens. Those who survived kept running. They crossed open ground while explosions erupted around them. They died in the mud, in the wire, in the craters, and more came behind them. This battle lasted months, her guide explained. A young woman this time, wearing the same Foundation insignia as hundreds of thousands died. The ground gained was measured in hundreds of meters, sometimes less. For what purpose? Asked. The waste of it was staggering, so many lives spent for so little gain. The young woman considered the question carefully. At the time, the humans believed they were fighting to end all wars, to defeat an enemy that threatened everything they valued. They were wrong about ending all wars. They were not wrong about the value of what they defended. From they traveled to a place called, on an island nation the humans called Japan. Here the landscape was different. Mountains rose in the distance. Ancient trees surrounded a rebuilt temple complex, but the same sense of solemn memory hung over everything. 300 warriors had made their last stand here. They had followed a code of honor that demanded death over surrender. They had charged a vastly superior force with nothing but swords, knowing they would die, choosing to die rather than abandon their principles. Holographic reconstructions showed the final charge. Men in traditional armor running forward into gunfire, falling, rising again if they could, falling again, fighting until the last one was gone. They lost, observed. Yes, the guide agreed, but they are remembered. Their enemies built monuments to honor them. Their story is told across centuries. Losing a battle is not the same as losing meaning. The next stop was underground, a network of tunnels called Kai, dug by humans who had been outmatched in technology and firepower. They had lived like burrowing creatures beneath the soil, emerging to fight and then disappearing again. They had built hospitals down here, kitchens, meeting rooms, an entire society hidden beneath the feet of their enemies. Had to crouch to fit through the narrow passages. The tunnels had been designed for smaller humans, but she pushed forward, wanting to understand. They lived here for years, her guide explained. The man was older, his accent different from the others. He had ancestors who had actually fought in these tunnels. My grandmother was born down here, in the darkness, while bombs fell above. How did they survive? They decided to survive. They decided that their cause was worth any hardship, any sacrifice. They were farmers and villagers facing the most powerful military in human history at that time. They won. The journey continued beyond Earth. On station, an aging orbital habitat that creaked with every motion walked through the memorial corridor. This was not ancient history. This had happened within the lifetime of species now crossing the stars. The contact wars. The desperate early decades when humanity had first encountered hostile alien life. The harvesters had come without warning. Robotic drones that descended on human colonies and stripped them of resources, including organic material, including people. Humanity had not been ready. Their ships were primitive. Their weapons were laughable by galactic standards. But they had fought anyway. The memorial corridor was a section of the station that had been sealed off and preserved exactly as it had been during the final assault. Scorch marks the walls. Debris littered the floor. Small plaques bore the names of the 43 humans who had held this corridor, while evacuation ships loaded behind them. 43 people with improvised weapons against harvester drones. They had known they were going to die. They had stayed anyway. Read the names one by one. She recognized nothing about them. They were just humans, ordinary people who had made an extraordinary choice. None of them had military training, the guide said. This one was not human, her species' former enemy in a brief conflict that had ended in unexpected alliance. They were engineers, maintenance workers. One was a school teacher. They picked up welding torches and broken tools, and they held that corridor for 47 minutes, long enough for 3,000 people to escape. Did any survive? No. Stood in the corridor for a long time after the guide fell silent. The scorch marks, the debris, the names on the wall. This was what humans preserved. This was what they considered sacred. The final stop was 442b, a world that humans had not fought for themselves but for others. The ridge of broken shields stretched across a mountainside on that distant planet. Human peacekeepers had come here during a conflict between two alien species, neither of which had asked for help. The war had been brutal. Refugees had fled from both sides, civilians caught between armies that cared nothing for their lives. Human soldiers had interposed themselves between the armies and the refugees. They had taken fire from both sides. They had been accused of interference by both governments. They had stayed anyway. The ridge was marked with simple monuments now, human names mixed with alien names. Some of the refugees they had saved had returned years later to add their own memorials, their own gratitude carved in stone. They were ordered to withdraw, the guide explained. Another human, young, with the same quiet intensity as all the others. Their government told them the situation was too dangerous, too politically complicated. They refused. They said they would not leave while civilians were dying. And their government accepted this. The guide smiled slightly. Their government court-martialed them afterward, those who survived. They were dishonorably discharged for disobeying orders. His crest flattened in confusion. Then why do you honor them here? Because they were right, because sometimes following orders is wrong, because they chose to protect the helpless even when their own people punished them for it. The guide gestured at the monuments. The governments that condemned them are gone now, changed, reformed, but these soldiers are still remembered. Their choice still matters. The 7 days of touring had changed something in. She had arrived looking for weapons and tactics. She had found something else entirely, something that could not be easily measured or. She requested a final meeting before returning to the Confederacy. There was one more thing she needed to understand. The Universal Military Heritage Foundation maintained its headquarters in orbit around Earth's moon. The station was large, far larger than any memorial site, sprawling across several connected modules that served multiple purposes. Archives filled one section, containing records and artifacts from every battlefield the Foundation preserved. Museums occupied another, designed for visitors who could not travel to the sites themselves. Training facilities took up a third section, where beings from many species came to study. Ambassador had requested an audience with the Foundation's director. After her week of touring, after walking through trenches and tunnels and corridors of sacrifice, she felt she finally understood what questions to ask, but she needed someone who could answer them fully. Director met her in a conference room that overlooked Earth. The human hung blue and white against the darkness, deceptively peaceful from this distance. The director herself was very old. Her dark skin was deeply lined, her hair completely white, her movements slow and careful, but her eyes were sharp, alert. They held the same quality had seen in every Foundation volunteer, that sense of solemn purpose. Ambassador said, settling into a chair across from her guest, I understand you have had quite a journey. I have seen many things, agreed. Things I did not expect, things I am still trying to understand. Nodded, she seemed unsurprised by this. What would you like to know? Had prepared her questions carefully. But now, facing this ancient human in a room overlooking Earth, she found herself asking the simplest one first. Why? The director waited, allowing her to continue. Why do you invest such enormous resources in maintaining these sites? They are just places where humans died. The dead cannot benefit from preservation. The ground cannot care whether it is remembered. Why do you do this? Was quiet for a moment. Then she rose from her chair and walked to the window. Earth turned slowly beyond the glass. I served in 3 conflicts, she said. The Martian uprising, the emergency, the Second Harvester War. I watched friends die. I killed enemies. I did things that still wake me in the night decades later. She turned back to face. When my fighting days were over, I asked myself what purpose all that sacrifice had served. What would remain when I was gone? What meaning could be salvaged from so much death? She returned to her seat, her movements careful but determined. The Foundation is my answer. We preserve not because the dead need it, but because the living do. We maintain these sites so that those who come after us will understand what we were willing to pay for the things we believed in. But why would other species care? Pressed. I saw them at the sites, meridians, even standing among your graves. Why? Smiled. It was a tired smile, but genuine. Every species we have encountered asks us the same question eventually. How did you survive? You were late to space. You were fragmented, constantly fighting among yourselves. You were inefficient and violent and primitive. By every measure, you should have destroyed yourselves or been conquered within a generation of first contact. How are you still here? She leaned forward. This is how. This is our answer. We remember. We remember every time our ancestors chose death over dishonor. Every time they sacrificed themselves for strangers. Every time they stood when running would have been easier. We remember because memory is the only immortality the dead can have, and because the living need to know that such choices are possible. Thought about what she had seen. The rows of white stones in Normandy, the muddy craters of, the narrow tunnels of Kai, the scorched corridor of Station, the ridge on 442b where humans had died for aliens they had never met. Other species have warriors, she said. Other species have made sacrifices. Yes, agreed. What they often lack is continuity. They forget. They let the lessons fade. They tell themselves that their ancestors' struggles are irrelevant to modern times. They move on. She shook her head slowly. We refuse to move on. We refuse to forget. And now others are beginning to understand why that matters. She rose again and gestured for to follow. They walked through corridors lined with images and artifacts, past groups of visitors from many species, until they reached a viewing gallery that overlooked one of the training facilities. Below, a class was in session. Young cadets, perhaps 30 of them, were receiving instruction from a human veteran. They were walking through a full-scale recreation of something called the Battle of Thermopylae. The environment had been reconstructed in perfect detail. A narrow pass between cliffs, a wall of shields, an approaching army that seemed to stretch forever. The human instructor was explaining how 300 warriors had stood against an empire, how they had known they would die, how they had chosen to die anyway, holding the pass so that others could escape and regroup. The cadets listened with obvious attention. Their crests were raised in what knew to be intense focus. They asked questions. They examined the shields, the spears, the terrain. They were learning something that could not be found in any tactical database. They come from many worlds now, said, species facing their own crucibles, their own impossible choices. They come to study our battlefields not for tactics but for something more fundamental. They want to understand how a fractured, violent, primitive species produced individuals willing to die holding a line, a ridge, a corridor, a pass. And what do they learn? That courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something matters more than fear, turned to face directly. The Confederacy faces a choice, Ambassador. You have come here seeking military expertise for your border dispute. But the real question you need to answer is not how to fight. It is what you are willing to fight for. What matters enough to sacrifice for. What kind of people you want to be. Watch the cadets below. They were practicing now, forming shield walls, learning how to stand together. The human instructor moved among them, adjusting positions, offering encouragement. It looked almost like a dance. "We would like to send our own cadets," she said slowly, "if you would have them." His tired smile returned, warmer now. "Ambassador, the ground is sacred because others made it so. All we do is remember. Anyone willing to learn that lesson is welcome here." The gallery fell silent as they watched the training continue. Alien students learning from human sacrifice, the past reaching forward to shape the future. Thought about her own people, their history, their conflicts, the choices they had made and the choices that lay ahead. She thought about the border dispute with the threshold dominion and realized she now saw it differently, not just as a political problem to be solved, but as a question of values. What did the Confederacy stand for? What would they protect? What would they sacrifice? She had come to Earth seeking weapons and tactics. She was leaving with something far more valuable, an understanding of what made humans dangerous, not their technology, not their numbers, but their memory, their stubborn refusal to forget what their ancestors had given, their knowledge that ordinary beings could become extraordinary when they chose to stand. The Universal Military Heritage Foundation had grown larger than anyone expected. What began as humans preserving their own battlefields had expanded into something that touched every corner of known space. Species that had never known war came to study the costs. Species that had known too much war found, in the quiet rows of memorial stones, a reason to seek other paths. And species facing their own crucibles came to learn what sacrifice really meant. As prepared to return to the Confederacy, she carried with her the names of battles she had never heard of before this week. Normandy, Kai, Station, 442B, Thermopylae, each one a place where humans had answered the hardest question any species could face. She would bring this knowledge home. She would share it with her leaders and her people. And perhaps, when the Confederacy faced its own moment of truth, they would remember what she had learned among the stones of human dead. The ground was sacred because others had made it so, and now others were coming to understand why.